1948. 20 hulking electric locomotives stood ready, 8 axles, built for Soviet rails and Stalin's empire, 5,500 horsepower apiece. Then the United States government slammed the door. Overnight, Little Joe was banned. Too foreign to sell, too powerful to destroy. $20 million of engineering genius marooned at an American port. Here is how Cold War paranoia nearly doomed the world's strongest engines. Until a broke railroad in the Rockies made a reckless bet and changed American rail history forever. Why did Moscow's locomotives end up fighting America's deadliest mountain pass instead? The General Electric EF4 did not look like any American locomotive. It was a brute, 170 tons of steel and copper, stretching nearly 90 feet from nose to tail. 8 axles, each with a motor the size of a barrel, pressed down on rails meant for the endless forests and frozen rivers of Siberia. The frame was a fortress, built to shrug off derailments and the -40 winters of the Urals. Every cable and relay was overbuilt, every panel bolted tight against the kind of cold that cracks steel. 5-foot-wide trucks, too broad for any track in the United States, sat beneath the body like a bear. The wheels alone weighed as much as a family car. Above them, a maze of switchgear and transformers waited for the 3,300 volts of direct current that Soviet lines supplied. This was not a machine for the gentle grades of the Midwest. It was designed to drag thousands of tons up mountain passes, to keep freight moving when everything else froze. Inside, the cab was all business. No frills, just a row of heavy levers and gauges labeled in Cyrillic, installed under the watchful eyes of Soviet engineers. The control stand was set up for 2 men, one to drive, one to monitor the endless parade of dials as 8 traction motors roared to life. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot oil, the floor vibrating with the thrum of power that could outpull a Union Pacific big boy steam locomotive. The electrical system was a marvel of its own. 8 motors rated at 750 volts, wired for maximum torque, drew power from overhead lines through a pair of pantographs that arched up like the antennae of some steel insect. The main bus bars, thick as a man's wrist, carried enough current to weld a wrench to the frame if you dropped it in the wrong spot. Everything about the design screamed endurance. No fancy streamlining, just slabs of riveted metal and a paint job that could survive a Siberian sandstorm. Yet for all its muscle, the EF4 was a stranger in America. The gauge was wrong, the couplers were wrong. Even the voltage was a headache. American lines used 3,000 volts, not 3,300. The locomotive was too foreign for the country that built it. But as it sat idle, engines cold, it was impossible not to feel a grudging respect. This was engineering at its most unapologetic, a machine built for war, for empire, for the kind of work that chews up lesser engines and spits out scrap. In the Erie shops, GE engineers walked the line, running their hands over the broad axles and thick steel beams. They had set out to build a locomotive for Stalin, and in the process created a monster too strong for its own time. The metal was ready. The world around it was not. On a gray morning in 1948, a telegram arrived at the port of Erie. The message came from the United States State Department. All shipments to the Soviet Union were to be stopped, effective immediately. The Cold War had turned a routine export into a national security emergency. Cranes, halfway through lifting 200 tons of steel onto a waiting freighter, froze in midair. Dock workers set down their gear. Soviet engineers, who had overseen every bolt and cable, packed their bags and boarded trains out of Pennsylvania. The order was blunt. These locomotives were now classified as strategic materials. They would not be leaving American soil. 20 locomotives, each one a technological giant, stood in limbo. General Electric managers, who had spent years building to a foreign blueprint, now faced a warehouse full of machines nobody wanted. The engines were too big, too heavy, and too foreign for the American railroads. The wheels were spaced for Russian tracks, 5 feet wide, not the American standard. The couplers were European hooks, useless on US freight cars. The electrical systems demanded 3,300 volts of direct current, a number that did not match any American line. Each unit was stamped with Cyrillic labels, a reminder of a deal that had evaporated with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. Inside General Electric boardrooms, the mood turned from pride to panic. The company had poured millions into the Soviet contract, expecting to recoup costs through volume and follow-on orders. Now the locomotives sat idle, gathering dust, their value dropping by the day. Insurance agents toured the storage yards, tallying up losses. Engineers debated whether it was cheaper to strip the engines for parts or to cut them up for scrap. Every day the clock ticked. The stranded fleet became more of a liability. The State Department's embargo did not just block a shipment, it turned a symbol of American industrial might into a logistical nightmare. No railroad in the country was interested in buying a locomotive that did not fit the rails, could not couple to standard rolling stock, and ran on the wrong voltage. General Electric salesmen made calls from coast to coast, pitching the engines as a bargain to any railroad desperate enough to consider them. Each time, the answer was the same: too risky, too expensive to convert, too much trouble. The port's storage lots became a graveyard for unwanted innovation. 20 machines, built for the harshest winters and the longest hauls, now sat silent behind locked gates. The only movement came from the wind rattling loose tarps and the occasional click of a security guard's flashlight. In the space of a single telegram, the most powerful electric locomotives on Earth had gone from prized exports to orphans, stranded by politics, frozen in time, and waiting for a miracle buyer who might never come. Milwaukee Road's boardroom was not a place for bold dreams in 1949. The railroad was running on borrowed time and borrowed money, its electrified mountain lines crawling along behind engines built before the First World War. Every month brought another repair bill and another warning from the accountants. There was no cash for new power, certainly not for anything as exotic as a Soviet export, but desperation can make a bargain look like a miracle. General Electric, stuck with a warehouse full of unsellable giants, was ready to deal. The price they had once quoted Stalin was gone. The new offer was almost an insult to the engineers who had designed the world's most powerful electric locomotive. 12 units, barely used, for about $1 million, less than a fifth of what it cost to build them. That worked out to 80-odd thousand per locomotive. For that sum, Milwaukee Road could buy a handful of new diesels, or it could take a leap on these orphans from the Cold War. The railroad's management signed the papers. The deal included not just the locomotives, but a mountain of spare parts, motors, relays, and enough copper wire to keep the shops busy for years. General Electric was happy to see them go. The engines were loaded onto flat cars and pointed west toward the Rockies. In the press, the purchase looked like a gamble bordering on reckless. Critics called the Little Joes a white elephant, a curiosity that would bleed Milwaukee dry. But in the back offices, the logic was simple. The railroad needed power, and nothing else on the market could match the numbers. The Little Joes promised 5,500 horsepower each, enough to pull the heaviest freights over the Bitterroot grades. Milwaukee's existing fleet was falling apart. The oldest electrics dated to 1915, and their maintenance costs were eating the railroad alive. Dieselization was sweeping the industry, but replacing the entire mountain fleet with new diesels would have cost millions, money the company simply did not have. The deal was not without risk. The Little Joes were built to Soviet standards, and every inch of them would have to be reworked before they could run on American rails. But the price was too good to pass up. For General Electric, it was a fire sale, a way to clear the books and move on. For Milwaukee, it was a last-ditch play. The engines rolled into the shops at Deer Lodge, Montana, their Russian wheel sets still too wide for the rails, their control panels still labeled in Cyrillic. Shop crews gathered around, sizing up the challenge. Old-timers shook their heads. The younger mechanics grinned. The railroad had not made a bet this big in decades. 12 locomotives, bought for pennies on the dollar, sat waiting for a second chance. The Milwaukee Road's future would ride on whether these Soviet-built monsters could be tamed. The gamble was set. The only way out was through the workshop doors and up the steepest grades in America. In the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, the Deer Lodge shops became a laboratory for American ingenuity. The Little Joes arrived as strangers, massive, mysterious, and completely out of step with everything the Milwaukee Road had ever owned. Shop crews, some who had spent their whole lives patching up ancient box cabs, now faced a machine that looked like it belonged on another planet. There was no manual for what needed to happen next. Every step was a gamble, every fix an experiment. The first job was the most physical. Those Russian wheel sets, 5 feet wide, would not even fit on the rails outside the shop doors. Mechanics rolled the trucks into the bay, marked the axles, and set to work with hydraulic presses. Each wheel was pressed off the axle, the steel measured and cut down, then pressed back together at precisely 4 feet 8.5 inches. The difference, a little over 3 inches, did not sound like much until you saw the old wheels stacked beside the new, the gap a visible reminder of two worlds colliding. One slip, and a wheel set could shatter under the weight of the locomotive. But the shop crews got it right, over and over, until all 12 engines could roll onto American track for the first time. Next came the couplers. The original European hooks were useless on United States freight cars, so welders cut them off and fitted heavy American knuckles in their place. Sparks flew as steel met steel, and the smell of burnt metal hung in the air for days. Every coupler had to be perfect. One bad weld and a train could break apart on a mountain grade. The crews worked with a kind of stubborn pride, knowing that nobody else in the country was trying anything like this. Each finished locomotive was a little less Russian, a little more at home in Montana. The real test was electrical. The Little Joes had been built for 3,300 volts of Soviet current, but Milwaukee's catenary put out 3,000 volts. Electricians tore into the control cabinets, tracing wires labeled in Cyrillic, swapping out transformers and relays to match the American system. Some of the younger men joked about learning Russian just to read the schematics. The old-timers just shook their heads and kept rewiring. The pantographs were checked and rechecked, the main bus bars insulated against stray surges. When the switch was thrown for the first time, there was a moment of silence, then the sound of 8 traction motors humming in perfect unison, drawing power from the mountain grid. Inside the cab, the transformation continued. Levers were relabeled, gauges recalibrated, and the heavy Soviet signage replaced with Milwaukee's own stencils. For the first time, an American engineer could climb aboard and know exactly what every dial meant. The control stands were tested, brakes adjusted, and the big steel bodies rolled out onto the yard for trial runs. Each locomotive passed inspection, one by one, until the fleet stood ready. The shop floor, once a place of skepticism and doubt, echoed with a quiet satisfaction. The Little Joes were no longer orphans, they were ready for the mountains. Snow piled high along the Bitterroot line as 2 freshly converted Little Joes waited at the base of St. Paul Pass. The crew in the lead cab glanced over their checklists, brakes tested, pantographs raised, controls humming with American voltage. Ahead lay 7 miles of track climbing at a steady 2% grade, a stretch that had humbled engines for a generation. Normally, it took 4 diesel units straining together to get a loaded freight over this mountain, each one belching smoke and fighting for traction. Today, just 2 of the new electrics would try to do it alone. With a signal from the conductor, the throttle went forward. 8 traction motors surged, and the entire train began to move, slow at first, then building speed with a smoothness the old-timers had not seen before. The sound was different, no roar, just the rising whine of electricity and the low rumble of steel wheels on frozen rail. Inside the cab, the engineer watched the emitter needle swing high. The Little Joes did not flinch. They clawed up the grade, pulling thousands of tons behind them, never dropping below 12 miles per hour. By the time the summit tunnel swallowed the headlight, the crew was grinning. The logbook for that run noted the time. It was faster than any diesel had managed, and without a hint of wheel slip. Down in the yards, word spread fast. The shop crews who had sweated through the conversion now had proof. These machines were not just a bargain, they were a revolution. The legend of the Little Joes began with that climb, 2 engines doing the work of 4, and doing it with style. The Little Joes did not just pass their first mountain test, they became legends on the Milwaukee Road. Crews who had spent years coaxing ancient engines over the Bitterroot grades found themselves at the controls of a machine that could outmuscle anything else on the rails. Old-timers who had doubted the Soviet orphans started telling stories in the bunkhouse. One engineer claimed a Little Joe could pull a full string of loaded boxcars up St. Paul Pass and still have power to spare. Another joked that the only thing louder than the motors was the sound of a diesel crew complaining in the siding. These locomotives did not just move freight, they hauled the Olympian Hiawatha, Milwaukee's flagship passenger train, slicing through the Rockies with a smoothness that left travelers in awe. When the Korean War and later Vietnam demanded heavy military shipments, it was the Little Joes that took the lead, dragging endless lines of tanks, ammunition, and supplies over the summit. The Mountain Division crews called them sports cars in a world of farm tractors. More than one engineer swore that a Little Joe would leap forward the moment the throttle opened, even with thousands of tons behind it. Oral histories from Deer Lodge to Avery tell the same story. Reliability, raw power, and a kind of stubborn loyalty. The crews gave the name Little Joe a new meaning, less a jab at Stalin and more a badge of pride for a locomotive that never quit, no matter the weather, the load, or the politics that tried to stop it. Today, as American railroads run almost entirely on diesel, the last Little Joe stands silent in Montana, a monument to engineering outlasting politics. The lesson endures. Innovation doesn't care about borders, but short-term thinking can erase decades of progress overnight. When we trade long-term value for quick profit, we risk losing more than just machines. What's your take? Was it vision or mistake? Let's talk in the comments.